York Festival of Ideas. It's great to see so many people like today, right? There's sunshine outside, and it's really impressive that you all came to listen, right, to this amazing talk. So my name is Razia Nuti. I work in the Department of Politics at the University of York. So it's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Jill Liddington, who, as probably you already know, is an award-winning writer and historian who specializes in women's history, and especially on the relationship between gender and class in 19th, 20th century Britain. She's also an honorary fellow, research fellow at the University of Leeds, and today she will be talking about the Anne Lister's 1836-1838 diaries. So, Jill, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks, Alicia. And many thanks to the York Festival, Literary Festival events team, who are super efficient and absolutely wonderful and have got us all here and done a fantastic job, an amazing programme, an impressive team. Question for you. How many of you watched Gentleman Jack? That looks to me like a good half. Yes. How many of you watched all episodes of both series, Series 1 in 2019 and 2000? Gosh, that's, again, probably a good third at least. Amazing. And how many of you have actually been to Shibden Hall? Oh, I am impressed, because it's quite a distance from York. If you haven't been yet, please go. It is a wonderful experience. It's wonderful grounds, and now Anne's house is a museum. And final question, how many of you read any of there's over a dozen books now about Anne Lister. Just pop your hands up. It's a sort of what you might call a thinner group of arms and hands. So I hope to make up for that this afternoon and not assume any knowledge. And that should work well. Well, one of the themes of the festival is rediscover, and I want to talk about how Anne Lister was rediscovered by our generation. In 2019, Gentleman Jack, first shown in America by HBO, home box office, and then by BBC One, it really brought Anne Lister to the wider world. Not quite global attention, but nearly global attention. And until then, until 2019, Anne Lister wasn't really known much outside the UK and much outside sort of scholarly historian circles. But let's focus on the real Anne Lister rather than Gentleman Jack, and what we know of her based on her diaries and letters. And in particular, her marriage, and I'm not going to put in inverted commas, but if you have inverted commas in your mind, that's fine, because it obviously wasn't a marriage in the conventional sense. Her marriage to Anne Walker. How did that compare to the conventional marriages of early 19th century Britain? And what were the rights that heterosexual married women had then? What rights and what freedoms did wives have then, when Anne Lister was writing her diary and married to Anne Walker and living at Shibden Hall? These are quite complex questions, and before we get on to their complexity, let's just remind ourselves about what the key things about Anne Lister. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Anyone can't hear me? Great. I think there are three key points which I think most of you who know about Anne Lister of Shibden Hall would agree that set her apart from almost everyone else. To start with, Anne Lister was a lesbian. She never ever had any romantic or sexual interest in men. She had affectionate relationships with men like her Uncle James, And she had respect, professional respect for men like her lawyer, Robert Parker in Halifax, and Samuel Washington, her land steward, helping her run the Shibden estate. But from the very beginning, Anne Lister had sexual and romantic relationships with women. The young Anne Lister met Eliza Raine at the elite manor school here in York, and I'm not going to suggest exactly which direction to wave my hand in for where the manor school was. It's fairly near the Minster, I think. And it gave her the advantage of a fairly academic education. They learnt globes, which we now call geography. And an affair with Eliza Raine, and then subsequently, when she was in her 20s and onwards, successive affairs with other women recorded in code, and more of her code we're going to look at later. And if we have to pick out any one woman that Anne Lister had a particularly deep relationship with, it was Mariana Lawton, who she loved, and Mariana Lawton loved her, but who betrayed Anne Lister, Anne felt, by Mariana's conventional heterosexual marriage to an older, wealthier man, as was just the convention in early 19th century Britain. Again, later, in 1832, Anne Lister was deeply wounded by yet another woman's conventional marriage plans. This time it was Vere Hobart. They'd been living together, sharing a house together down in Hastings, and then Vere Hobart was to marry Mr. Cameron. And despondent, Anne Lister trudged northwards home to shabby Shibden, very despondent, and back to her uninspiring family, to her elderly father, to her irksome younger sister Marian, and to her beloved Aunt Anne. And she retreated to Shibden's library because she was an intellectual. She was intellectually curious. But she was also an action woman. And she was soon busy redesigning Shibden Hall so it would look like the houses of her elite women friends. And she must find a life partner. Before long, reacquaintance with Anne Walker helped. Anne Walker was a wealthy yet shy neighbouring heiress. She lived on the Walkers' conveniently close Crow Nest estate, and from now on, Anne Lister did not waste a minute. So in 1832, having returned to Shibden, she set about very speedily, but also deftly and so effectively, wooing and seducing Anne Walker. So by the 17th of September 1832, Anne's diary recorded in code. She, Anne Walker, said it would be as good as a marriage. Yes, said I, said Anne Lister, quite as good or better. 2 years later, 1834, there was an informal betrothal and exchange of rings. And then at Easter that year, 1834, they took the sacrament together in York at Goodham Gate Church. Anyone visited Goodham Gate Church? Yes, because it's very, very near the Minster. And it's a lovely little small church. And I'm just going to read from Female Fortune as to how it's recorded in the diaries. So this is Sunday, the 30th of March, 1834, and it starts off in code, and I have to whisper it to you, therefore. 3 kisses, better to her than to me. Then she goes back into handwriting. At Goodham Gate Church at 10:35, Miss W, that's Miss Walker, and I, and Thomas, the servant who was there to carry the prayer books and the Bible, the 3 of them stayed for the sacrament, and then back into code. The first time I ever joined Miss Walker in my prayers, I had prayed that our union might be happy. She had not thought of doing as much for me. So it meant a lot to Anne Lister, this particular moment at Goodham Gate Church. It symbolised it for Anne Lister marriage, though of course it was recognised by neither the church, the Anglican Church, or indeed any church, nor by the state, nor by civil society. Nevertheless, Anne Lister was so persuasive, and they saw their union as so permanent, that Anne Walker moved into Shibden Hall that autumn with Anne Lister and the Lister family. And from mid-1836, they lived at Shibden on their own. Anne's elderly father had just died, her sister had departed, and her beloved aunt had died. So it's just Anne and the servants, which is the focus of As Good as a Marriage. The main takeaway point here is, I think, that Anne Lister would never deploy the fig leaf of heterosexual marriage, and in this she was very, very unusual. We can contrast Mariana Lawton and Vere Hobart, and of this lesbian marriage to Anne Walker more shortly, but continue telling the story in As Good as a Marriage. But let's go to the second point where Anne was remarkable. Anne Lister was a world-beating diarist. Her diary was approximately 5 million words, as in 5 million words, and about a sixth of that is in code. It started as a schoolgirl diary when she was 15 in 1806 with the words, Eliza left us. Eliza Raine had been staying with the Lister family in their middle-class house in Halifax, and Eliza left us. And this has established the first line of the diary, the lesbian relationship between Eliza and Anne. By 1808, so 2 years later, Anne had evolved her own fairly impenetrable code. And this runs for the next 32 years. 32 years. She was an indefatigable diarist. Daily diary entries in the diary growing in length, particularly in the 1830s. Every intimate detail of the relationship with Anne Walker and herself is in code. And then in handwriting, she goes on to talk about how she energetically managed the Shibden estate and its tenants. She was entrepreneurially active and successful. How she was involved in politics, especially at elections, and her prodigious reading. You name it, she read it. Geology, yes, very exciting geology. Travel, yes, must go to Russia. Intellectually very adventurous. And Anne Lister continued her diary with scarcely a gap till her death in 1840. So let's look at the code, and I've conveniently brought along a page for you. We'll have a look at this in a bit more detail later on, but I'd just like to draw your attention, if I might, because I don't think you can read. Can you read a word? Anyone read a word? It's very difficult to read a word, isn't it? The code is tricky. So the top of page 215 is in code, and you can see there are separate signs. They're not joined together. Each vowel is a number. Each consonant is a shape. Sometimes, likewise, two consonants together, like TH or GH or double S. And the handwritten sections are almost as impenetrable because there's lots of abbreviations, and you can sometimes pick out an individual word, but it really is quite difficult. But I think what I'd also draw your attention to is she's a very organised diarist. You can see at the top of each page, or the 2 pages you've got, the number. Can you see a number at the top of the page? 215 and 216. And then what year are we on? 1837, and the month is August. And then if we start on the left-hand page, page 215, we can see it's Thursday the 17th, and that runs out down for most of those 2 pages. So a very organised diarist. But because of all the abbreviations, so Anne Walker is Miss W dash, Samuel Washington, the land steward, is SW. It's very difficult to read. The handwriting is in a way more difficult to read than the code. And even the most determined transcriber can feel defeated, especially if they don't live locally. So we'll come back to this shortly. But because of our theme of the festival is rediscovered, I think what people want to know is who cracked the code and when. Well, does anybody know? It's a melodramatic story. After Anne Walker's death, we know that Anne Lister died in 1840. Anne Walker lived a little bit longer, died in 1854. And at that point, Shibden Hall was inherited by some distant Listers. Anne Lister, of course, herself had no direct descendants. And the son, John Lister, when he grew up, became a scholar and an intellectual, an academic. And he started transcribing the handwritten passages and publishing them each week in the Halifax Guardian from 1887 onwards. And he's very interested in politics. His politics, as we'll see, are very different from Anne Lister's. He had been in the Liberal Party, and then he moved leftwards and actually became the treasurer of the Independent Labour Party, so consorting with people like Keir Hardie. Very different from Anne Lister's. So he started with the 1837 election and continued on for about 5 years. But that was the handwritten sections. He could not crack Anne Lister's impenetrable code. I mean, how frustrating was that after all these years of working on them? And then about 1892, he was puzzling over this incredibly difficult code with a Bradford antiquarian, Arthur Burrell, who was a schoolmaster at Bradford Grammar School. And many years later, many years later, Arthur Burrell wrote, and I'm going to quote from what his letter said. And he's looking back over the years. He's looking back to about 1892. Thank you. Burrell had borrowed a volume of the diaries just to puzzle over the code. And he took it back to John Lister and Shibden. And here I quote. Up to that time, we knew nothing of the coded alphabet. I distinctly remember taking a volume back to Shibden and telling Mr. Lister I was certain of 2 letters, H and E. We then examined the boxes behind the panels, and if you know Shibden, you'll know there's a lot of wooden panels. And halfway down the collection of deeds, and there are a lot of deeds in Shibden over the centuries, we found on a scrap of paper these words, "In God is my..." We at once saw that the word must be hope, and the H and E corresponded with my guess. The word hope was in code, and with these 4 letters almost certain, we began very late at night to find the remaining clues. We finished at about 2 o'clock in the morning. The part written in cipher turned out, after examination, to be entirely unpublishable. Times change. The part written in cipher turned out, after examination, to be entirely unpublishable. Mr. Lister was distressed, but he refused to take my advice, that's Arthur Burrell's advice, which was that he should burn all 26 volumes. He was, as he knew, an antiquarian, and my suggestion seemed sacrilegious, which perhaps it was. And Arthur Burrell goes on, the coded passages presented an intimate account of homosexual practices amongst Miss Lister and her many friends. And, Burrell added, this very unsavoury document contains evidence that these friendships were criminal. Criminal? How could what Anne Lister was doing be criminal? Well, it was a fairly popular held belief. Because in 1885, which was probably just 7 years before they actually cracked the code, an act, i.e. legislation, an act had made all homosexual acts, which traditionally had been punished harshly, they made them completely illegal. And you all know about the 1895 Oscar Wilde trials. That's probably the best known, and it was known as the Blackmailer's Charter. And it's likely that John Lister himself was homosexual, and it caused him considerable anxiety because there was discussion at the time of homosexuality being an inherited disease condition, so that he might have caught it from his indirect ancestor. It was absolute fear at the time. If you think of what happened to Oscar Wilde, who was a fairly flamboyant character, John Lister wasn't. He was quiet, introspective scholar. It would have just been awful for him. And a 40-year silence proceeded thereafter. The diaries were put back behind the panels at Shibden. And John Lister never wrote another single word for the rest of his life, till his death in 1933 on Anne Lister. He wrote about everything else, including aspects of Shibden, but not on Anne Lister. And I think that helps give us an idea and a sympathy with anybody who was homosexual, particularly male homosexual, after the 1885 Act. It was harsh. Ironically, lesbian relationships were untouched by the 19th century legislation. Women weren't thought to have that kind of sexual interests or behaviour or passions. But what surrounded lesbianism was a culture of silence, a culture of secrecy, a culture of shame. So that's what Burrell meant, I think, when he talked about Anne Lister's friendships being criminal. They weren't, but you could see how anything that sort of touches on criminality takes with it silence, secrecy, and shame. So let's return to Anne Lister's diaries herself. They are magnificent, combining both the intimacies, the tensions and quarrels of the marriage with Anne Walker, and politics. There's a lot about politics, particularly when it comes to election time. And Anne Lister is an industrial entrepreneur who even developed her own coal mines and she inherited a large house which she turned into a hotel in Halifax, and she turned that into a casino, which it had a slightly different meaning than it did the more sort of louche meanings of the era of Monte Carlo afterwards. And the diaries in 2011 were recognised by the United Nations, that is, internationally. They were included in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register alongside Samuel Pepys, who I think we'd all probably agree is the best known of the British English diarists, probably. Though Samuel Pepys merely wrote 1.25 million words. So those of you who are good at arithmetic have realised that Anne Lister wrote 4 times as much as Samuel Pepys over a much longer period. Pepys, born in 1633, died 1703, so he's a century or so earlier than Lister, was also well educated, as Anne Lister was, but unlike women like Anne Lister, he could not go to university. He could go to university. He went to Magdalen College, Cambridge, and then thanks to some well-connected patrons, he got prestigious employment. And he managed to rise within government employment, becoming secretary to the Admiralty. And his diary is also in a form of cipher, shorthand. But what we might just remember is that such employment opportunities, plus university education, were closed to women, even Anne Lister, for many a long decade afterwards. And my final point about Anne Lister generally is she was a member of the landed gentry. Her own family, as she grew up in Halifax, was middle class and really rather disappointing. Her father was an old soldier, but he'd only been I think it was captain rather than one of her distant relatives who became a general. Her mother, much younger than her father, turned to alcohol, and she found her younger sister, Marianne, pretty irksome. They had 4 brothers, but 2 died in infancy. one in adolescence, and then her only surviving brother, Sam, who followed their father into the army as an ensign, he died by drowning in Ireland in 1813. And it must have been such a loss for Anne, because she was really very affectionate towards her brother Sam. And 2 years later, that is 1815, her unmarried Uncle James and unmarried Aunt Anne invited Anne to come and live at Shibden. And Shibden was not a middle-class house in urban Halifax. It was just not, as anybody who's been there knows. It was over the hillside. It was an ancient farmhouse. It was built in the early 15th century. And I know people in York are going to say, oh, that's nothing. We've got umpteen streets built in the early 15th century. The Listers only acquired it through marriage in the early 17th century. But nevertheless, Anne, who had social aspirations, liked to embellish how ancient were the Lister acres that she'd inherited. So from 1815 onwards at Shibden, Anne Lister was living there and showed promise, showed energy, and knowledge about how to run an estate like Shibden. Indeed, in 1826, when her Uncle James died, she inherited Shibden from him. Yes, she had to give the right to live at Shibden to her elderly father and beloved aunt, and they had the right to live there during their lifetime, and they could collect a third or receive a third of the rents, with Anne receiving the further third. So she had to share it, but essentially she has inherited it. But they were minor landed gentry, unlike, say, the grander Norcliffes. You might remember from Gentleman Jack, Isabella Norcliffe, Tib, she drank a bit, had an estate on the other side of York, and they were sort of grander gentry. Or possibly even the Walkers of Crow Nest, their estate was bigger, but of course they were new money, they were commercial, and really that made them not count at all. And certainly Anne Lister was never a member of the aristocracy, despite her keen social ambitions. She was an adept social networker, and if she walked in here and we were all just chatting, you'd know Anne Lister because her conversation would be so charismatic and compelling. She befriended elderly Lady Stuart, who lived mainly in London, whose two sons were called the Honourable Stuart Wortleys. One was elected MP for the new constituency of Halifax, and the other was the Blue, i.e. Tory Conservative candidate for the West Riding constituency. So you can see where their politics lay. And through Lady Stuart, Anne became friends with the next generation, Lady Stuart to Rothsay, whose husband had, as it happens, been ambassador to France, and so on. Anne was an adept social climber. And back on the theme of rediscovery, in As Good as a Marriage, I quote more of the letters that Anne Lister wrote, because she didn't just write the diary, she wrote letters. And the letters I quote most are where she's trying to charm, or successfully impress and charm, these minor aristocratic women. She suggested to the Stuart family that she had considerable political influence and could help the Honourable Stuart Wortleys at election time get into the House of Commons. She and Anne Walker, who had even more tenants, could influence those tenants who had the vote. I mean, never mind that women had no vote. It didn't matter at all, because what had yet to be passed, what allowed such women landowners to have such influence? There was no secret ballot act, and that wasn't to happen for another generation. So a poll book was published after each election, listing how every man who had the vote voted, and Anne could take a note of which of her tenants, if any, had the temerity not to vote for the Wortleys. They wouldn't. You know, if you were on an annual lease with a small land holding and a family to keep, you would not vote for the wrong person. But As it happens, neither of the Wortleys won the 1837 election, because when it came down to it, both Anne Lister and even Anne Walker were political minnows compared to the great Whig grandees of the Leeds area, etc. I'm going to leave Anne Lister there because everyone will want me to say something about how I discovered Anne Lister and what about her captured my imagination and time and energies. I moved to Halifax in 1980. I don't think there's anybody from Halifax here. No. Nobody knew much about Anne Lister then, outside the Halifax Antiquarian Society circles. And then, in 1984, The Guardian published an article called The 2 Million Word Enigma, and it ended, she might well have been a lesbian. However, such is life. I was busy working in adult education at Leeds University Extramural Department, as it was called then. And not long after, Helena Whitbread, who also lived locally and had worked on the early Anne Lister diaries, published her version of that. That's just early 1817 to 24, and focusing particularly on the coded passages. And Virago published that in 1988, and it had considerable local impact and controversy. Indeed, 1989, the Halifax Antiquarian Society ran a day school in Halifax Library about Anne Lister, with Helen Whitbread amongst the speaker, plus local historians, plus the museum curator from Shibden, which has now become a museum. Debate grew heated. Debate grew very heated. Essentially, were the coded passages recording the lesbian relationships more important than the handwritten social history passages? And it grew furious, and I came away mentally noting blood on the library carpet. Almost no exaggeration, I hope. So by then, I was fascinated, and I decided to go into the Halifax archives to check whether it really was 2 million words, as The Guardian said, because The Guardian kept on misprinting things. Even his own name, the Groundad, we used to call it. And you had to do it on microfilm. Anyone remember microfilm? And whichever way I did the calculation, it came out as 4 million words. And I thought, oh, my goodness. I retreated from the archives, ashen-faced, took a couple of days to recover, and then decided, I can't leave this. This is too important. I need a research strategy. And what I decided to do was to drill down into the diaries by selecting 3 short sections. The first section, and all this is in presenting the past. The first section I focused on was the earliest diaries, which had only just been discovered, so they predate the Helena Whitbread years, 1806 to 1810. Second, because this fitted in with teaching my local history adult students, I looked at late 1819, when, as you all know, was the time of the infamous Peterloo massacre in Manchester. And third, I chose late 1832, and I selected because it not only included the first general election after the Great Reform Act, which gave more men the vote, plus Anne Lister's courtship of Anne Walker, so it was too enticing. By then I was completely hooked, and I decided to focus on the later Anne Lister, as Helena Whitbread had worked on the earlier diaries. Helena had read the coded passages first, and only later gone back to the handwritten sections. I decided that my strategy must be to read the diaries as Anne Lister had written them, slipping effortless from code to handwritten and then back to code again, almost within one sentence. This was the 1990s, and I was teaching in adult education classes, which took up much of my time. However, I still found time for transcribing and editing, and my eyesight. If you ever worked on printouts from microfilm, you know it's dark grey print on pale grey paper, and your trips to the opticians get more and more frequent. Strained my eyesight. But the result was Female Fortune here we are. And it came out in 1998. It was the Anne Lister Diaries, 1833 to 36. And it did garner some warm reviews. And yet afterwards, in the next sort of couple of decades, there was limited interest in Anne Lister of Shibden Hall, other than the UNESCO recognition in 2011, which we've looked at. However, scriptwriter Sally Wainwright had grown up near Halifax, and shortly after Female Fortune was published, a mutual friend, somebody I knew and she knew, gave her a copy of Female Fortune, and she was immediately smitten. We worked together energetically, trying to answer all her research questions, she trying to pitch scripts, and she pitched script proposals for a drama to TV companies. But they said, Sally who? But she was just a jobbing script writer. And somebody has to write The Archers, and somebody has to write Coronation Street, and that time it was Sally Wainwright, because everybody has to start somewhere. But she went on a few years later to write, anybody watch Last Tango in Halifax? Yes, very successful. And then Happy Valley? Yes. Exactly. So she ceased to be a jobbing scriptwriter, right? Became a celebrated one. And I knew she hadn't lost her interest in Anne Lister when she was invited onto DIDS. Anybody know DIDS? Desert Island Discs? Yes. Which everybody pretends they don't listen to, but do really. And after she'd chosen her music, they said, oh, which book would you like to choose for your desert island? And she said, oh, I'd like to take 26 volumes of the Anne Lister diaries. And the woman said, no, you can't. And without a pause, Sally said, oh, well, I'll take Jill Liddington's Female Fortunes, the diaries 1833 to 36. And my heart almost lost a beat there, because it's every author's dream to be cast away with the Bible and Shakespeare on a desert island. So once again, now celebrated scriptwriter.
Sorry, it's an hard job, but we're chairs.
Right, I'm going to now leave a few bits out. Celebrated scriptwriter Sally Wainwright pitched her Anne Lister scripts proposals to the BBC, and they responded very enthusiastically. They said, when would you like to start, Sally, and how much would you like, how much money would you like? And later HBO got the United States involved, and Gentleman Jack aired, as you know, in 2019. Indeed, post-Gentleman Jack, everything went swimmingly for those of us involved at Anne Lister. It was partly because an American woman who I got to know, called Pat Esgate, lived in New York State, was absolutely won over by Gentleman Jack, and organised Anne Lister birthday weekend, Anne Lister's birthday being early April, which is now expanded to Anne Lister birthday week. And so my diary was full of Anne Lister talks, walks, book signing, with all these Americans having booked their planes to come to Halifax. Until March 2020 and COVID. And we all know what the lockdown was like. For each of us, it will have had a different effect. I found it disorientating, depressing, scaring, and I slashed through my diary pages. But I'm a projects person, and I couldn't just sit at home. And within a few weeks, I'd embarked on a sequel to Female Fortune. I'd embarked on As Good as a Marriage, which takes the story up from 1836 to 38. So let's just remind us that's when Anne Lister and Anne Walker were living at Shibden on their own, their father having died, elderly father died, irksome sister Marion departed. I won't say she was banished, because banished is a very hard word, isn't it? But she left for East Yorkshire, never to return. And then beloved Aunt Anne died. So it was just the two women and their servants. So what was their marriage like? They were now a settled couple, and like other settled couples, they enjoyed cosy evenings together together sitting in front of the Shibden fire. They would read together, often reading aloud what was interesting in the local newspaper or national newspaper, or reading travel books. Anne Lister, desperately keen to visit Russia, and perhaps her favourite book of the time was by Captain Cochrane, a pedestrian, not pedestrian in the sense of boring, but pedestrian in the sense of like that, a pedestrian journey through Russia and Siberia. And there was a round of social visits out in the carriages, out into the countryside beyond Halifax, to pay calls on Anne Walker's many relatives, plus longer trips up to the Dales, and in 1838 to France, to Paris, and down to the Pyrenees. And then, given I've only got a couple of minutes left, I'm going to be a little brief. There were also silences, tensions, and quarrels. Initially, they were about servants who had the right to sort of boss them about. With Marianne gone, was it Anne Walker's role to issue orders? A bit tricky, that. And then there were more tensions about money, because Anne Walker, of course, had far larger rentals from her larger number of tenants than Anne Lister, and she was generous towards Anne Lister with loans and gifts. However, Anne Lister wanted Anne Walker to bear the expenses of Shibden Hall, the food, the upkeep, the servants. And that was hard for Anne Walker because she was responsible for the maintenance of some of Crow Nest, and she balked at this. And she felt that Anne Lister cared more about Shibden's ancient acres and her legacy, her Lister legacy at Shibden, than she did about Anne Walker, her wife. And I'm going to end on this note, which is a little bit harsh, and it's not absolutely typical, but this is 1837. Quarrels. Beyond tensions, quarrels. She began crying, and Lister said something harsh. This is in code. I changed my manner, said all this was ridiculous. She wanted a good whipping, and I got to be right, and I told her I must buy a rod, and in truth I must not indulge her too much. And then it gets worse. What can I do with her? I must be off, leave her as soon as possible. And now let's just go back finally to top of page Thursday the 17th. And she says, and this is the second line down in the middle, but I think you'll have to take my word for it. So top of page 215, second line down in the middle, she says in code, how lucky I have not introduced her to anyone. The sooner she goes, the better. Well, I can have excuse enough for being off any time. While she is with me, I must hold the rein tighter. It was talking about Anne Lister and Walker as if she was almost a horse. I mean, they did have good times together, and they did go to France and to Paris and to the Pyrenees at the end in mid-1838. But there were these tensions, and sometimes reading these coded passages and the tensions, the quarrels, and some of Anne Lister's language, the first time I read it, again, I paled because I thought it was really so very harsh. And I think probably I just end by saying we can come back to how much this compared to conventional married women's rights, but just might say that I don't think just because Anne Lister wrote these things in her diary, she either meant it on a long term or she actually ever did anything like buy a rod or give Anne Walker a whipping. I think it was just a way to a sort of, what do you call it? I've written it down. Emotional escape valve. Yeah. That's the word I want, or phrase I want. An emotional escape valve for her frustrations, that she couldn't leave Shibden the legacy she wanted, which was probably via an heir. But they did have good times together, and they did travel to Paris and the Pyrenees at the end, as good as a marriage. So I'll leave it there, and apologies that the last part was slightly rushed. And I shall look forward to your questions.
All right, so yeah, thank you so much. All right, so we have time for some questions. I'll just stand because I I can't see all of you. So, anyone?
Who'd like to start off? Because I've whizzed over...
yes, over there. Yeah. Sorry, can you just wait? Someone is coming with a microphone, so everyone can hear you.
I've never kept a diary, so it's not something I understand, but it's fascinating. Why do people keep diaries? Do people keep diaries because they want to just chronicle their life, or do they keep them so they're there for posterity, for other people to read? So, can you imagine why Anne Lister kept her diaries? Did she want people to read them in the future?
I don't think she could foresee the future.
It's tricky.
She started the diary very, very briefly, just to say that Eliza had left. It was a schoolgirl diary. It was very, very short. Eliza had left, and then it takes up a little bit about writing a letter to Eliza, and then she goes continuing her education, even though she's left the manor school, with some sort of tutorials with one of the clergymen in Halifax, who often amongst the most educated people. And what is noticeable with Anne Lister is that as her social status changed, so did her diary writing. So, like many of our diaries, it starts very short and grows in length. But with Anne Lister, it grows in incredible length. So after she moves up to Shibden in 1815, and she's there with her Uncle James and Aunt Anne, living in ancient Shibden, the entries grow longer. And then once she inherits, on the death of Uncle James in 1826, longer. And then when she returns to Shibden in 1832, having been rebuffed by Vere Cameron's conventional marriage plans, it gets even longer, partly because she's running the estate as well as wooing and seducing Anne Walker. And by the time it ends in 1840, or I end the book in 1838, they are very, very long. Did Anne Lister think that anyone was going to read her diaries? I think we just need to note that she wrote it in two halves. The half in handwriting, which nobody would mind anybody else reading. And then the sections about a sixth in code, which she probably felt she didn't want other people to write. And she was an observant Anglican. She fervently believed in the Church of England, the power and influence of the Vicar of Halifax, and it was a great big parish. And she knew that God had created her nature as he wanted. He wanted her to be a lesbian. But she also recognised that civil society, social society, did not share that feeling, that belief. So what would Anne Lister feel seeing us all sitting here in the centre of York, a city she knew so well, and not far from the Gundramgate Church, where she'd conducted this private marriage ceremony with Anne Walker, taking the sacrament together. I think it's difficult to know, but I think in a way she would be very pleased that everything she achieved, and she achieved so much, to make a real go of Shibden Estate, whereas her uncle and predecessors had been a bit sort of traditionalist about it. She said, coal, it's going to be coal, so I'm going to dig 2 coal mines, and she did. And her travels as well. I think she'd be quite pleased, but obviously it's so difficult for her to see into the future. It's a difficult question to answer. Has anyone got a question that's easier to answer?
Oh, yes, over there. Someone waving.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that. I wonder if you would mind saying a bit about Anne Lister's mountaineering.
Anne Lister's
mountaineering, or her travel more broadly. I'm a lecturer at the University of York, and I'm supervising a student at the moment who would really like to write about Anne Lister's mountaineering. I am guiding her as best I can, but as the expert, I would love to hear any sort of particularly interesting moments in the mountaineering passages, or any scholarship out there that I really need to direct her towards.
Well, that is an easier question to answer. She was an adventurous mountaineer at a time when very, very few women did climb mountains. I've only climbed one of the mountains that Anne Lister climbed, so I'm going to focus on that. And the person you should advise your student to read in the Halifax Antiquarians is Vivian Ingham, who did the pioneering work on that, and I was slightly reliant on Vivian Ingham. In 1838, so this is the end of As Good as a Marriage, and I included in the epilogue, they left London just as London was getting all in a bustle about the impending coronation of Queen Victoria, and who was going to be there and what was going to be said, and was it going to be better than, was it going to be an improvement of the British monarchy, which it turned out broadly to be. They left London, sailed across the Channel. Anne Lister was sick, seasick, and Walker wasn't. They then got their carriage, went with them down to Paris, where Anne Walker consulted a doctor for her various ailments, and then they went down to the spa towns, Saint-Sauveur, etc., on the foothills of the Pyrenees. They did some climbing together, but it quickly transpired that Anne Walker wasn't as brilliant a mountaineer as Anne Lister. And Anne Lister, with two local guides, two local Frenchmen who knew this part of the Pyrenees very well, set out in summer 1838 and climbed Vigmerle or Vignemale, the highest peak in the French Pyrenees. I was so impressed by this, I thought, right, well, if she can, maybe I can. And luckily, I had an advantage over Anne Lister. I have a brother who's an experienced mountain climber because he teaches geology as science. And so, if in doubt, go up a mountain. And he led us up, me and my partner and my sister and him. And we stayed in a little cabane because you couldn't do it in one day. And we had to set off from that little cabin. There was a lot of people sleeping there very early, about 6 o'clock in the morning, having had a bit of breakfast, and get further up. And it's very windy at the top of Vignemale. And people say, well, why didn't you take any photographs of the top? And we were so sort of swaying about and worrying about taking our crampons off because it was a bit rocky. We didn't come back with any photographs on the top. And it was then, by then about 11 o'clock, I can't remember exactly, and we started walking down, first down the rocky bit, and then putting our crampons back on to go over the glacier. And Tim, my brother-in-law, said, we must hurry. If we're not over this glacier by midday, when the sun is really at full heat, the fissures in the glacier will melt, and it'll be incredibly dangerous. And the thing that came to my mind was that program on television called The Weakest Link. And that was me. I was the weakest link. I just could not hurry, wearing my crampons. We were roped up, of course, Tim at the front. I was in the middle somewhere. And it was, with every footstep I took, I got more and more in awe of Anne Walker. We did manage to get over the glacier, descending from Vignemale without any fatalities or accidents or anything. But it was not my happiest moments, and I certainly wouldn't do it again. And then, once you get beyond that, it gets much easier. And we went home and back down to our little chalet, and I think opened a bottle of wine to celebrate having climbed Vigmerle. That's the only mountain of Anne Lister's I've climbed, but there are others. And yes, Vivian Ingham and her partner, Phyllis Ramsden, wrote about Anne Lister's travels, and your student might enjoy reading those, which is going to involve a visit to Halifax Library, probably, Halifax Archives, because I don't think the Phyllis Ramsden typescripts are digitalised yet. I don't think. Any other questions?
Yeah, we may have time for just another question. So let me, yeah. If you can just wait for the microphone. Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned the Peterloo massacre during this, and I was wondering, what did Anne Lister have to say about that? And more generally, politically, did she have any party affiliation? Were there particular figures she was close to? Or how much did she touch on this in her diary?
Good question, good question. In Helena Whitbread's book, because she was more interested in the coded section, she didn't say anything about Peterloo. And I thought, that's weird. Anne Lister sort of was reading the newspapers and up to date with everything. She must have known. So that's one reason why I chose, and I was teaching my students about Peterloo because it was so important, the massacre in Manchester. So I went back to the diaries for August 1819, and what's stunning, or I still find it stunning, is the massacre took place early afternoon that day. It was like 1:30 or 2 o'clock. And the news came from Manchester to Halifax by the end of the afternoon, early evening. And that's a lot of galloping of horses, must have had a change of horses. And Anne Lister was aware of the the Peterloo massacre by the end of the day. At that stage, her political beliefs hadn't really hardened. She was a little bit more open-minded. She talked to a radical shoemaker at some point. And somehow all shoemakers seem to be radical, all that hammering. And he was absolutely shocked and told her how shocked he was that innocent civilians, women and children, etc., should be killed by the hussars, by the soldiers. But gradually, and she followed it in the newspapers, but gradually, as she inherited Shibden Hall, which was 7 years later, and then came back to run it, in 1832, her politics hardened. And they hardened into what was known as blue politics. That is Tory, what was soon to be known as, or it was becoming to be known as the Conservative Party. And she did everything she possibly could to ensure she could maximise the blue Tory votes at parliamentary elections, 1832, 1835, 1837, particularly by doorstepping her tenants. And about 20 or so of her tenants had the vote. I can't remember the exact number. And she would go and visit them. And she would stand on the doorstep, and she said, "Are you going to be voting? Your landowner is making the only request I've ever asked you any favour. Will you help her with this favour?" And even the bravest of tenants, and the ones with the sort of more substantial income, they were perhaps running little businesses or they had a slightly larger acreage, didn't vote for the Whigs, i.e. the opposition. They were just away on business in Scotland. My husband just had to go to Scotland on business that day. So that gives you an idea of what power even voteless women had. And what was quite interesting is in the 1837 election, when of course Anne and Anne are on their own, Anne Walker is even more fervently. She has an absolute ding-dong with the sons of the woman who runs Shibden Mill, which is now a rather expensive hotel in Shibden Valley, but then really was a mill. And he's quite grumpy as to why he should vote for, for something that he doesn't believe in. It's very interesting that before the Secret Ballot Act, which was another generation, Anne Lister and Anne Walker had far more political influence than a single male tenant who would only have one vote. And I think that's quite significant. And also quite significant is, why did it take so long to pass the Secret Ballot Act? We take it for granted. You get somebody in the polling booth looking at you and you go, "Oh, no, you shouldn't do that." It's a secret ballot. And it's very revealing about Victorian England, which is what it had become, that it was thought if you had the vote, you should be proud to say how you voted. So it was becoming rather unrealistic after 1832, when more working class men or lower middle class men could be, if not coerced, at least lent on by their employers or they're landowners. So there you are. Have you got time for another question?
Well, we are running a bit out of time, so
Right.
sorry about that. So maybe we can do a very, very quick question and a quick answer.
Anyone got a quick question?
Anyone? Oh, yeah, sorry. You see, I have this sort of a very bright light on my face, so sorry.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed the presentation very much. I have read the first 2 books you presented on the table, and I've acquired the second one. Does the second one influence next series of Gentleman Jack?
Is this the second one?
Yes.
Is this the one you're talking about? Who am I to say? I mean, you may be aware that there's a sort of LGBT, women in the LGBT community, particularly in America, a campaign for Series 3 of Gentleman Jack to be commissioned. And as I understand it, and I'm not directly involved, so please take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. Sally Wainwright is keen, though she's doing other things, writing other things like Happy Valley. BBC is interested. The production company, Lookout Point, is interested. But, and it is unfortunately a big but, HBO, home box office, which is American dollars, and particularly American Hollywood dollars, has not given it the go-ahead. And so keen was the LGBT community in East Coast America that if you've been to New York, you might know Times Square. They have advertisements flashing up and down. They booked a strip of Times Square to have commission Series 3 Gentleman Jack and bits of the diary going up and down, etc., etc. But as yet, I haven't heard anything. I mean, they remain keen, and if any of you know any very wealthy Americans in and around Hollywood or maybe New York, please let the people involved know. I just don't know whether there's going to be a Series 3 or not. We can just hope.
Okay, so on this kind of still a bit hopeful note, so join me to thank Jill again for a fantastic talk and for answering great questions from our audience. So I think that many of you may want to get hold of the book, so you can do that from our independent bookseller, Foxline Books, and Jill will also be there to sign any copies. So thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and please check the other events of the York Festival of Ideas.